Welcome! Today we're going to talk about civil service. How do we staff the bureaucracy? How do we give people jobs? How do we do the work of government? How do we hire people? This is an interesting topic, and it's a lot more complex than you'd think. In part because in the private sector we can kind of hire whoever we want as long as we don't violate any laws. But in order to maintain the integrity of the bureaucracy, we've used a variety of different ways to staff, and we've ended up with kind of a complex web of rules of hiring and firing and union involvement. So I'm excited to talk about it. First of all, public employment in the United States is not super large compared to other industrialized nations. We have about average number of employees. That's to say that when people argue that the government hired too many people, that's really doesn't hold up in the data. And actually, over the past 40 years, we haven't changed the actual number of employees in the federal government, more or less. Now, some government employment has grown in other areas, and that doesn't actually consider contractors. One way that we can sort of hide how many people actually work for the government is to give contracts to private companies to provide services for us. And when we do that, those people don't show up as employees of the government. Technically, they do government work, but they're not employees, and they're not covered by employee benefits in the same way that true public employees are. Now, a lot of people argue that, gosh, there are so many employees in the government, and they cost us so much money. You know, almost half of all of government employees work in education. They're teachers. They work in libraries. The other thing is that we don't think about police officers as public employees as often, but when you start looking at teachers, librarians, and police officers, that constitutes a vast majority of all people who work in the public sector. And we talk about, cutting the budget and letting go of some of these people because they cost so much money. But if we started to cut the number of employees, what it does is it actually weakens our ability to provide government services. And when we talk about like a hypothetical 10% cut in employees, it actually only translates to about a 1% cut in federal level spending. So where do we end up spending all that money? Well, we'll talk about it in the budget. But really, it's not actually on people as much as it is on programs. So people are actually really integral in providing government services. So how do we do that? Well, historically, we've gone through a variety of different phases. It started with political patronage. We'll talk about that. So when somebody would be elected, they would be able to return favors for helping get elected to people so they got employed in the bureaucracy. We had some problems with that, and we crafted something called the Pendleton Civil Service Act, and it sort of broke that in the strength of that patronage system and established new ways of hiring based on merit and ways that we could insulate the bureaucracy from political tinkering, when parties started messing with who gets hired and fired. Well, then, over the course of time, we've adopted different ways that government employees know what their job is, and some other constraints on the system. And those are collective bargaining, unionization, public sector unions. It's the most common method of gaining protections in business. And individuals come together as a group to fight against management problems, and they essentially all agree to bargain together. We'll talk about all three of those, but let's go back to political patronage first. Historically, what would happen in cities and even in the federal government someone would win an election and they would bring their staff with them to run that government agency. So, for example, a city mayor would win an election and they would fire all the high-level staff, and they might fire everybody down to the meter readers or the people who put out the candles on the street lamps. They would be able to fire whoever they wanted, and they would be able to hire people that they knew were loyal to them, who could get the job done, and in some ways to just reward their support for their political candidacy. That led to a lot of loyalty and a lot of support for political candidates, but what would happen is that would engender a lot of political support. People would want to elect somebody who they were friends with or who would return a favor to them. It really didn't help the bureaucracy in any way because someone new would get elected and it would wipe out all the competency or technical skills of that agency. So the agency would be very, very responsive to the electoral winner, their boss, but not to those people who were the electoral losers. And I can't imagine a system in which, if you're of one political party, you would punish the other political party by, cutting off electrical service or enforcing more fines and fees against them. That's the sort of thing that happens with political patronage. So we'd have lots of staff turnover, we would have a lot of politics in how that government function was being performed, and we realized it was a real problem. So the Pendleton Civil Service Act, among other things, established a different system. Now, we're going to talk about that in just a second, but political patronage still exists in the federal government at the federal level, on mostly high-level staffing choices for the president. So when a president gets elected, they have about 4,000 positions that they get to fill. These are ambassadors, vice deputies, assistant deputies to, whatever, but also all the cabinet level positions that we talked about. The president gets to choose who those people are. They're confirmed by the Senate, but they're loyal supporters of the president. We have similar systems in the state, where the governor will be elected, who has the ability to appoint some people to commissions, high-level leadership positions, but those are fewer at the state and local levels. So even though political patronage is there, we have the civil service, which is what we're going to talk about, that staffs most of the bureaucracy, and they perform most of the functions of government. So a lot of people say, well, how do I get a government job? How do I do this? Well, the best advice in business is network with a current employee. Have somebody on the inside, especially a family member. Write a really good resume. Be a veteran, or already have a government job. What? Okay, so in the civil service and hiring for government, those standard rules don't apply. You can't sort of know somebody on the inside because of rules about not giving away jobs to people that we're related to. Knowledge cannot be a factor. Knowledge of another person cannot be another factor in hiring decisions. What's interesting is writing a really good resume, having good experience, that'll help get you a government job. Being a veteran, having already served, that'll help get you another job. And having already a government job will help you get a different government job. So this is what happened. We saw the problems with political patronage, and we said, this is not going to be good. And we set up the civil service system. And in the civil service system, employees are hired based on merit. That is to say, they know what their expertise is. They're hired for a specific role. They are not hired based on who they know. They're paid based on their position. In other words, if you perform this function and other people perform similar functions, they're all going to get the same pay. And as you take on more responsibilities, you're going to get more pay. But you can't know somebody and get a raise. It just doesn't work that way. You're paid based on your position. You're also obligated to accountability. That's to say, you give up some of your freedoms and you are asked to be monitored more often. You willingly are monitored because we're using citizens' dollars and citizens' authority to act on their behalf. So we have to be accountable for that power, and people are guaranteed to watch over you. We are also protected against political interference. In other words, if I am a Democrat and there's a Republican in office, they simply cannot fire me based on my political affiliation. Or if I am a Republican, a sheriff's deputy, and a sheriff who is elected who is the opposite party, then they can't fire me based on my party affiliation. They have to fire me based on showing that I can't do my job. And so we set up this really firm boundary between politics and merit. And so the civil service system is a way to hire people based on what they know, the job that they perform in, to ensure that they are protected against political interference, and essentially to provide stability to the functions of government. We talked about in org theory about structural model, and we talked about, well, we need this specific role to be performed, and we need this sort of characteristic. Well, the civil service system is exactly a response to that structural model of the bureaucracy. We need a person to do this thing who has this skill set, so we're going to hire them based on that skill set. It doesn't matter who fills that job, as long as they can perform that function. And so we take a lot of the personality out of the hiring process in the civil service system. At least we try and minimize insider information, political tinkering, who you know, nepotism, and really try to hire people based on their merit. Now, what we just talked about was called position classification. Every job has a classification. It's identified in terms of the specialized knowledge the job requires, its level of difficulty, the types of responsibilities that come with it. And when you start looking at these job positions, they'll have a classification, and it has like a code. It'll say like GS level 9 or 7 to 9. And it says this is the kind of difficulty and responsibilities it has. It'll also say whether or not it's management or administrative or a specialized skill like a scientist. It'll tell you what kind of job track you're in. Now, when you when a position opens, it'll say this is the type of role and responsibility. It's in a management type track. So if you're in a management track, you can apply for that. And you get hired into that position based on your individual merits in matching that position. And all these positions are classified. They tell you exactly what responsibilities you have. Like, you'll be required to travel, you'll be required to lift a certain number of weights or work outside or this sort of overtime. All of that stuff is in your job responsibility, because think about it, we're talking about delegated authority. And delegated authority comes with it specific roles and responsibilities. And then additionally, when you're evaluated in these jobs, you're evaluated against your position and your classification. So when somebody says, I can't make that decision because it's above my pay grade, what they're really saying is they're saying, I've been given this set of responsibilities, which corresponding is also what I get paid. We're paid based on our position. And the decision that you're asking me to make is in a position classification that has responsibility that's higher than me and gets paid more than me. So it's that appeal to, well, I don't have that power. I'm only paid based on this amount. And if you want to get that answer or get that special request filled, you have to appeal to somebody who gets paid more than me, who also has more power than me, more responsibility than me. So we staff these people based on their knowledge, competencies, their abilities, their experience in fulfilling that type of job with that type of responsibility. Then we compensate them based on that position classification. We call that the position-pay relationship. In other words, you are paid based on your position, not based on anything else, really. Your performance in that position may matter in small degrees, but really, everybody in that same position classification gets paid the same amount of money. Let me just talk about that more specifically. Our positions are defined based on our occupation, our degree of difficulty, the responsibilities. And there's an entire HR department in the federal government, similar in the state governments. Local government has an HR department who essentially does the same function. But at the federal level, we call this the Office of Personnel Management. The Office of Personnel Management defines what jobs do what functions and what level of pay they should be given based on that position classification. And the pay that they're given is based on the general schedule, or the GS schedule. It governs all of these grades in the civil service. So I'm just going to click over to that. The GS schedule for LA is in your PowerPoint. This pay schedule is actually 32% higher because of our cost of living. So the numbers we're going to look at, because we're in the LA area, because I'm in the LA area, are significantly higher than somewhere in maybe working in Kansas or working in Iowa. So let's click over to that really quickly. Here's the salary table for LA in 2020. It's a 32% higher for LA Long Beach. They're going to get a 3% increase this year. That's a cost of living increase. So let's say we move down here to something like you're going to get a college degree. And maybe you have some job experience, maybe a year or two. With your college degree and maybe 2 years of experience, you'll get hired in a GS level 6 position. At that position, your base salary, the lowest amount you can make for getting hired into that position would be $44,000. The most you'll ever make in that position is $57,781. So you could be hired into any of that range. These are called step ranges. The position classification over here is your job grade. The grade defines what responsibilities you would have and the type of work you would be doing. Now, your experience and your performance evaluations every year, or however 6 months, however often your boss evaluates you, would determine what your steps are. So time in rank, time in service, job performance, your manager could bump you up from this step to this step over time. And you might get an internal promotion or a step raise based on years of service or job performance. But ultimately, if you were doing a GS level 6 position with that kind of responsibility, you'd be maxed out at $57,781 in 2020. Okay, well, cool. In order to get a raise, like a big raise, you actually have to take on more responsibility. And if you take on more responsibility, you have to take on a new position. And that new position, you'd have to be hired into. Let's say you have a couple years as a GS level 6, and you see an opening at GS level 8. You think, gosh, I could do that job. And you apply for it, and you get that new position. You will have new responsibilities. You'll have more people to be accountable to. You'll have new things you got to do in your job because we can't pay you more and not ask you to do more. So we'll talk about that in just a second.